Today, in our Flutter Fundamentals video, we'll discuss state. Managing state is an indispensable part of app development. After all, an app needs state or data to be able to show and manipulate it based on user actions. In this video, I'll explain what state is, how it works, and provide 3 examples of effective state handling. Plus, I'll share my preferred method of handling state, which is simpler than the other options. Let's get start. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the general architecture. I want to give you kind of an overview, an architectural level overview of what exactly state is. And this part is very, very important in order to understand how to build state in your apps. Because if you can understand this, everything else is going to be very, very simple. So in this first diagram, we have the main app architecture. So remember, in typical apps, mobile apps, web apps, desktop apps that are used by users, we have a UI, we have a logic layer, and we have a storage layer. So typically a user is going to be interfacing with this layer only, and this layer is going to be talking to this layer, and this layer is going to be talking to this layer. So you're never going to have situations where a user is dealing directly with storage, or the UI layer is dealing directly with storage, or where logic is is being dealt directly with by the user. You're never going to have those situations. So it's very, very important to understand kind of this overall, this MVC, this model view control. We kind of have the model here, right? We have the view, and we have the controller that kind of ties everything together. Now, when we think about state, right, the most important thing to understand about state is this formula here, right? And it says the layout of the screen, which is the UI, equals to the function, which is your build methods, and then state as a parameter. So what this essentially means is that you take all the state and then you have your build method. So you have a function that kind of does something to it, like logic, etc. And this is basically the UI. This results in your UI, right? And essentially, in kind of layman's terms, right, this means that your state, what's happening with the app at any given point of time, right, while the user is using it, right? So if the user started using it and, they're doing something with it right there when you freeze time, right, you're going to have state that's going to be slightly different than it was, maybe 5 minutes before. And obviously in maybe 30 minutes or 20 minutes the state is going to be different, but the UI always needs to be reflecting this current state, right? That's the secret here. It's easy to manipulate state, right? State is not an issue manipulating. The trick here is, how do you get the UI to always reflect current state? That's really what it's all about. And this is how you build reactive apps, right? This is how you build apps that immediately display up-to-date information, up-to-date state. They change all the time. You don't have to press submit, you don't have to refresh, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to wait. They basically reflect the current state. That's essentially what this means. And so here's a little diagram here just to kind of explain it. And what's going to happen is, typically you're going to do something to the app. An app is going to receive an event, right? This could be something done by you, right? This could be you clicking on something. This could be something you're inputting. Maybe you're typing in a text field. Maybe you're clicking a button. Maybe you're dragging something, right? This could be user input. This could be a situation where an app is getting data, right? It's getting data. So it's waiting on data, right? Maybe it sent a request. It's waiting on data. Maybe it's doing something else, and then it gets data. Okay, so it's not something that you did. It got data from a third party. That's also a situation. Another situation is maybe a timer, right? You have a timer. Maybe you set a timer for like 1 hour and the timer expired, right? So now you have an event that says, okay, timer expired. Do something with the app. So these events can come from all different, sides, from all different situations, right? Could be you doing something. It could be some kind of an asynchronous event, right? Maybe a timer, maybe some kind of a data you're getting, or it could be a synchronous event. So maybe you're reading data and the app is waiting, right? The app is not doing anything. It doesn't really matter where those events are coming from, but the key point here is that something happened, and then you need to display the the UI. You need to refresh the UI as a result of the state being changed. Because if you do not refresh the UI, then it's as though that nothing happened. Well, when it did happen, when something did really happen. So this is kind of the flow, right? We have something happen and we need to display it, which is kind of the same thing as this formula explains. Is kind of a different angle, right? This is the state, and then you have the UI. So something happens, we need to display it. So that is the most important thing when it comes to understanding states, because it's very, very complicated. Lots of people are kind of talking about it. There's lots of stuff being kind of discussed, but really at the end of the day, this is the most important thing. You have something change within the app, something happened, right? As a result, events, data, maybe an API call, maybe user input, etc., and you need to display that. If you don't do that, then your app is just not as reactive, right? So maybe you do it like 30 minutes later. It's not good enough. It needs to be done right now, right away, right when the state is changed, right? So this is kind of the secret here. So now that you kind of understand it, I want you guys to think about it, how you would implement it in your apps. And I'm going to show you some really, really good examples. But before I do that, right, the way you're going to be implementing is, well, you're essentially going to have a piece of your app that's going to depend on external events, and then it's going to, display the data based on, something happens. So essentially, you're going to have, inside the code, you're going to have something that implements this flow here. Okay. So now that I've shown you kind of a general diagram, a very, very simplified version of state, and believe me, in real life and real uses, it's not that far off. Okay, it's not that far off. It's really, really that simple. Let's go into code and let me show you some examples, some state management techniques of how you can implement state right now in your Flutter app. All right, so here I am inside the Visual Studio Code, and this is an IDE, integrated development environment, that I prefer. And so if you want to follow along, I would encourage you to go ahead and download this ID. It's absolutely free, and you'll be able to download the code here to this video in the description below the video. So here I have a very, very simple app, and I essentially created the different applications. So remember, in Flutter, everything is a widget. Okay, everything is a widget. Everything that's displayed is a widget, but also an application itself is a widget. Okay, so I essentially created a bunch of different applications, and that way we can switch them and run them, and I can show you a different state management technique. Now, the first state management technique I want to show you is a very, very simple state management technique that's built into Flutter. And this is a technique that you're going to see when you create a very simple Flutter app. So if you go ahead and you do something like this, and you say Flutter new project, the project that's generated, a very, very simple project, it's going to be using this technique. So here I have my main Dart file. This is where everything starts, and I'm running this app simple state. And this is the app right here. So if I click on this file, this is this app right here. This is app simple state. And so essentially how this works is we have our kind of main page here. So we have this app. It loads this my home page, right? This is my home page, and this is a stateful widget. And when you create a stateful widget as opposed to a stateless widget that we have here, you also create a state class and you assign it to this widget here. So now this widget also has an additional state class, right? And this is going to be kind of the main widget, right? So right here, we are creating state for this widget, this my homepage widget. And this is the actual class that's used to actually do everything, right? Display the UI as well as the handle state. And so this is called my homepage state. And this is the main kind of widget. Okay, so we have this build method. And remember, the build method, you're always going to have the build method because that's what generates the actual widgets. And we have this build method. And what we're doing here is we have a center widget here that displays a text widget. And inside the text widget, we have a counter variable. And if you scroll up, we set the counter variable to 0. And just below that, we have a floating action button, which is a column. And inside that, we have two children, and they're both floating action buttons. And the first one, if you click on it, it's going to run this method called increment counter. And the second one is going to run a method called decrement counter, okay? And all they're going to do, if we scroll up, we're essentially, increasing the counter by 1. We're incrementing it, and here we are decreasing it by 1, okay? So we essentially have like a state widget here, and it has a variable called counter. That is our state, and we have two methods that are going to be kind of manipulating this variable, okay? And so if we run this app real quick, I can show you how it works. So if we come over here, we run this app right here, and here's our app. This is our first application. We are displaying that initial counter, and it's set to 0 because that's what we are initializing to. Now, if you click this button, you see it's incrementing the counter by 1, and it's also displaying it. So it's not only incrementing it, but it's also displaying it, right? So if I come in here, no matter how many times I click on it, it instantly reflects the state, which is kind of exactly what we're doing here, right? We do something, that is the act of clicking that button and running that method, but we're also displaying the newly updated data, right? Which is very, very important. So if I click plus a couple of times, I can see that. I can also click minus, and that's going to work in reverse, right? It's going to decrease the counter, and it's also going to automatically display the new value. So why is this happening? Well, it's very important to understand that if we come to App Simple and we scroll down, we see that we are manipulating this counter. We're increasing it by 1 or decreasing it by 1, but there's something more happening here, right? We also are wrapping this operation inside of a set state function. Now, this set state method here is part of this state class here. Remember, we initialize this state class for our my homepage, and this is the state class, and it has things like init state and set state, right? So we can potentially wrap this counter inside an init state. And so if you scroll down, you have an onPressed method which calls this function. Now, if this operation was not inside of set state, so if I move it out and I have an empty set state, it's not gonna reflect the change, right? So if I save this, and let's say I comment it out, doesn't really matter, it's empty, but let's comment it out, and I run this app again, okay? So I go ahead. Now, if I press this button or press this button, it's not gonna update this, right? So if I do that, you see nothing is happening. And even though that counter changes, it's not updating it. And that is because we're not telling the Flutter framework that we need to rebuild these widgets. We're not telling it that we need to rebuild these widgets. And so if you wrap it back here, right? So if I undo all that, what's going to happen now is that this counter is inside set state. And every time you see counter, right? So right here, we see counter, it's going to automatically rebuild this widget. So counter depends on it, depends on this text widget. So text widget will be automatically rebuilt. That is the simplest way of doing set state. This is the simplest, absolutely simplest way of doing set state. And typically, if you're building a very, very simple app, this is going to be enough because it works in situations where you don't have crazy things going on with inside your app. You don't have a lot of storage. You're not working with a lot of variables. You're not working with a lot of complex content. If you check out Flutter's documentation, they talk about two different types of state. They talk about very, very simple state, and then they talk about all the other kind of complex examples. So in very, very simple state where you might have a widget and that widget is managing its own state, this is going to be enough. But if you're building more complex apps where you're going to have, different widgets depending on different pieces of state, this is not going to be enough. You kind of have to go and try some of the other methods that we're going to be covering in this video. Now, the next state management technique I want to show you is the provider technique. So here's a quick example where we are using the provider state management technique. Okay, so if we scroll down, what we have here is a counter. Okay, so we have a counter and we're using a change notifier here. We're using a mixin called change notifier. And this is very important. And inside this counter, we essentially have a variable called count, which we initialize it to 0. We have a getter, right? Getter called count, which returns this internal variable. And then we have the increment method that increments the count variable and has a notify listeners call. So we have a function called notify listeners. Now, here is our main app. This is the app provider state, which is a stateless widget. This is kind of the top level app. And the main difference here is that in the build method, instead of returning the material app directly, which is something that we did in the previous example, right? So here we have the simple state app, we have the build, and we are returning the material app. What we are doing here is we are returning a change notifier provider. Okay. And inside of that change notifier provider, we are doing a couple of things. So first of all, we are creating a context. So we have a context here that has this counter class. So we're essentially injecting our counter model, this counter class, into the context, because we need to have access to that counter later on inside of our app. And then the child is this material app, which is, what we need to display. Now, material app has a home page. We scroll down to the home page. In this case, it's now a stateless widget. Because we're using a third-party state management technique, we no longer need a stateful widget. Okay, we're not using Flutter's state management technique, the set state, init state, and all that. We're going to be using, providers, so we can just use a stateless widget. And inside the stateless widget, whenever we want to display the actual UI, remember, so something happened, and now we need to make sure that the UI is going to be reloaded, rebuilt, refreshed, whatever you want to call it. We need to wrap it inside of a consumer. Okay, so now this child is a consumer, right? We can't just display the text. We need to wrap it inside of a consumer, because this is the part that needs to change, right? So if we check out our diagram real quick, right? This part right here, this is the consumer. This UI is the consumer, because this is what needs to be refreshed as a result of this. It's kind of this if then. This second part is the consumer. Okay, so inside of this we have a consumer counter. This is our the type of the consumer, and because we injected this counter into our context, we have a build method from the consumer, and then it has a context, a counter, and a child. So this counter is typically, it's a value, right? This is what you want to be dealing with, right? This is what we injected here into the context. So in this case, we injected the counter, so I can just call it counter. And now we have access to this counter. Okay, so now we can return the text, and now we have access to this counter class. And in this case, we're returning counter.count, because count is the getter here. So we're essentially returning this internal variable here. And now we are, now it's going to automatically refresh, and it's going to show the right thing. But there's something else that's very, very important to do. We have the consumer, but we still need to do the producer part, right? We need to do the part that, generates an event. So in this case, we have a floating action button, just like the previously we did. And inside of it, we have the onPress. So if we press it, but we need to generate an event. So we need to increment that state. We need to manipulate the state now. Here we're displaying the state, but here we need to manipulate it. So what we have here is we have a way of getting that context, right? So remember, we injected our counter into context. So here we have a convenience method that essentially using this provider off counter. So we got that counter back, and now we can call this method on that counter. This is kind of how you have to do it, because here we have a consumer that gives you access, right? But here you don't have a consumer, right? You need to use provider off. That is kind of how you have to do it. And that is, now we can increment it, right? So we're calling increment, which is right here. Now inside of increment, we need to call notify listeners. If we don't do that, none of this is going to work, because it's not going to tell them that, we need to reload the UI. So let me run this app and let me show you how this works. So I'm going to change my main app here. So now we're using app provider state. Let's go ahead and run it. All right. So here's our provider state management app using the provider state management technique. And if we do that, if we click on the button, you see it's increasing the counter, but it's also reloading the state. You see that? Now, if I comment out this part right here, if I comment here, and if I comment this part out, it's not going to automatically reload anymore, right? It's not going to automatically do what we want to do. So if I go ahead and run this real quick, all right? So now we have the app. So if I click on this button, nothing happens, okay? Because it's not notifying the listeners, right? So if we come over here, it's not notifying the listeners. It's not notifying the system. So the consumer doesn't know that, this thing needs to be reloaded, right? So you always need to notify listeners. And this notify listeners is actually part of this change notifier, because if you remove this, you're going to have an error here, right? So you need this change notifier. And this is part of this. So you're notifying the listeners that are using this consumer, okay? So that is a provider example right there. Now, the next state management technique I want to show you is the block state management technique. And this is a very, very comprehensive, it's a very, very powerful, but it's also fairly complex. It's the most complex state management technique that I'm showing you in this video. And it's also one of the most state management techniques in Flutter as a whole. So let me show you how this works. We have app block. This is our main app here. Okay, so we have app block state extends material app directly. We're not extending a stateless widget like we did in previous examples. We are extending a material app. And inside here, we are initializing app block state. And we are also initializing our counter page, right? So everything starts at counter page. I'm going to go in here. This is our counter page. And in this case, we have a stateless widget and we have a build method. In this build method, we have a provider. Okay, so it's that same idea, right? We have a provider and we have a consumer. This provider is dealing kind of with state. It's getting those events. And then we have a consumer that's responsible for rebuilding the UI. And so this provider, we are creating this qubit, and this is a terminology. This is part of kind of the block terminology. You have these qubits, and they're essentially, they deal with events, right? They deal with, anytime you have an event, you have a qubit that kind of deals with events, because it receives events and then it emits the state back. Okay, so we have a qubit here, and we have a block counter view, and the child is a view. It's another view. So if you come to this view, this is our kind of main app. Okay, and so what does this app do? It basically does the same thing as the previous examples. We have two parts. We have the part where we are displaying the current counter, and we have the part where we are, generating various events. So things like incrementing the counter, decrementing the counter, etc., etc. So this part here is displaying the text, right? So it's wrapped inside of a block builder, and it's using this block counter qubit, right? So this is the part that's getting the events, and this is an int, right? So this block counter qubit, this is the qubit right here, and essentially it's a wrapper on top of an integer, right? So we initialize it at 0, and then we have two methods. One is to increment it, and in this case we want to emit a state +1, and here we have a decrement method which emits state -1. So it's very, very similar to kind of the previous examples, except we have a lot more boilerplate. We have a lot more examples, a lot more things that are happening, but it's a very, very, very similar to kind of the previous examples with the provider. Kind of very similar idea. Here's a quick block diagram. Hopefully it's going to help you to kind of understand it better. You have the UI, you have the block, and you have data, right? So this data block is dealing with the data, but this is where the magic happens, right? You have these qubits here, they emit the state, and then you have the UI that sends events to block. And that is exactly what we have in our app over here. So if we go to our view here, right, this is the part, we have the qubit that emits the state. So we have this qubit block that emits the state to the UI. And this is this block builder, this block counter qubit. And then here, we have the stuff that emits events into here, right? So the UI, sends events into the block. And what we have here is we have two floating action buttons. The first one is incrementing the value, and the second one is decrementing the value. So very, very similar example as compared to the previous ones. And so let's go ahead and run this app. Let me change this real quick. So I'm gonna take a look at this. This is app block state. We're gonna go put it right here. In fact, I have it right here. And another thing that you can do with block is that you can initialize an observer that's gonna be telling you what's happening. It's an optional step, but it's gonna show you exactly what's happening. So I'm gonna comment it out for now, just to kind of show you an example. So we're using this block state. I'm gonna run it, and let's go ahead and see what's happening. All right, so this is our block counter example. So if we hit the plus button, you can see that we're sending those events to this qubit, and this qubit is sending back the state, which is kind of what state should be doing. So we do that, we do this. Works perfectly, okay? Now, if you uncomment this is an optional step, right? You're gonna see things happening, right? So this block that observer, this block observer, counter observer, this is right here. And what this counter is, it extends the block observer and then has a bunch of methods. So one method is unchanged. So it's a way to kind of see what's happening with your state, right? So if I run this app right now, I'll go back to main and I run it. We're gonna see in our terminal what's happening as we're changing state. Very, very cool feature, and a very nice way to kind of see what's happening. So I'm gonna go ahead and open my terminal, this debug console here. So now if I hit plus, you will see right here, Flutter, block counter, qubit change, current state, next state, right? So it's also telling you different levels. So, you know, it was 0, then it became 1, it was 1, became 2, it was 2, became 3, and so there you have it. So very, very cool. It's a nice kind of observer that you can connect to the block counter observer and see all the state that's happening on your app, right? All the state that's being changed, right? So because if you go to this block counter observer, it's just a general observer, right? It's not tied to anything. And so if you have a lot of state that's happening, you will see all the state that's being changed, right? All the machinery that's doing stuff, right? So if you come over here to our block and you take a look at kind of the view right here, which is where things are happening, there's a lot of things. It's the most complex, but even with all the complexity, I think it's a great framework, and it's going to have a lot of use, right? That is, if you feel comfortable kind of understanding, you know, the data layer, the data provider, and all of these things, you know, how everything works, okay? So, in my opinion, there's a lot of boilerplate, a lot of things happening. In my view, there's a lot easier ways of managing state with Flutter. And let me show you my preferred way of managing state. And this is actually a built into Flutter. So we're not going to be using any third-party libraries. We're not going to be using provider. We're not going to be using block. We're not going to be using anything else. This is built into Flutter. So let me show you this, my favorite state management system. So here's my favorite state management system. And we also have an app here. It's called Best State. And we're using Material App directly. We're not doing anything. And here we have this homepage widget here. It's a stateless widget. So we're not using that set state that we used in the first example. But in this case, what we're doing is we are using something called the value notifier, okay? So in this case, we are gonna have we have an integer, and we're using this value notifier. We are wrapping it inside a value. So in this case, it's a simple value, just an integer, but you can also use more complex types. I'm gonna show you a little bit later how to use more complex types. But instead of just, you know, having something like a final, you know, counter equals 0, something like that, we have a final value notifier int. The type is int. Value notifier int 0. So we essentially just initialize it to 0. Now we have the build method. And the first part of the build method, which you should know by now, is we have the consumer, right? So we are going to be showing the widget, the updated widget. And in order to do that, we have a center. So we're centering whatever we want to show, but we need to wrap our content in something called a value listenable builder, right? And this is the part that's going to reload the widget anytime that we change the state, okay? So we need to wrap it inside a value listenable builder, and we give it the variable that if it changes, this thing needs to rebuild. So it's called the value listenable. This is part of this. And we give it counter, which is this right here. And then we have a builder, which gets the context, which gets the counter, and gets the child. So it's very similar to kind of the provider. And then we display the counter. Right? Remember, counter is just like an int. It's an int. It's a value notifier, but we don't need to, you know, do anything special here. We can just display it directly. And here's the part that's the producer, right? This is the part that's producing the state. We have a floating action button. On press, we're just saying counter that value, right? Because the value is inside this value notifier, right? That is the value here. And so what we're doing is we are increasing the value inside of this notifier, right? We are increasing the value, okay? So we initialize it at 0, But if you press the button, we are going to be increasing it by 1. So let me go ahead and run this app so that you can see how it works. So let's go ahead and copy this. Let's come back over here and let's use one of these examples here and paste that app best state. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. All right, so here's our app and we can press this button. And as you can see, it's automatically updating our state. And obviously you can create a button that decreases the state, do all of these things. And what's nice about this state, well, number one, it's built into Flutter, okay? My philosophy with any kind of software development, if it's built in, I'm gonna use that. That's gonna be my number one choice, as opposed to using something as third party, and provided that it's this quality, right? I'm not gonna use, something built in if there's a much better way of doing it via third party. But in this case, it's a really nice, very clean method because we do not need to notify listeners. We do not need to do anything. It's all built in. It's all works together. Now, let's say you want to use a more complex type. You want to do something else, that, you want to build your own model and you want to do it yourself. Well, in this case, you need to create a class. So here I have a bool type and it extends a value notifier bool, which is a boolean, right? So it's not an int now. And here I'm saying bool type and I'm initializing this, the superclass, from where I'm subclassing it to true. And then I'm defining a method called invert. And what it's doing is it's taking the current value and it's setting the opposite. So if the current value is true, it's going to make it false. If the current value is false, it's going to make it true. So now we can use it inside of our app, right? So we can come over here and we can say final, we can say bool type, my bool, and then we can say, okay, so now we can use this model here. And now that we have it here, we need to change how it works, right? So I'm just going to say bool type, and here I can say my bool, okay? And now I have my value here. I can just call it my value here, and I can just say my value. Okay. And now I can display the value that I'm being passed here. And here is our function. And in this case, we can just call this invert directly, right? So we have this counter. I can just say my bool invert. And now anytime we're changing state, this is going to get refreshed automatically. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and run this app right here. Our best state. Okay. Now it's displaying true. If we press this, it's displaying false. Press this, is displaying true, true, false, true, false. And so that is a quick way of using this amazing state management technique with more complex types, right? So remember, you can use a simple type like we were using before, this value notifier in, or if you want to create a more complex type, you can just subclass it, add your methods, you can have your initializer, and that way you can configure this consumer here and this producer here as well. And in my view, this is probably the best way of managing state in most situations. Granted, there are going to be situations where you might want to use a different technique, but this is my favorite way of doing state because you are dealing with the consumer, you're dealing with the producer, and everything is automatic. We're not using any third-party libraries. We're not using any third-party packages, and that makes handling state very, very easy and very, very straightforward. Now, if you want to take a look in the documentation, you're going to see that there's lots of different ways of kind of managing state. You can manage state using futures. You also have streams. You have lots of different things. You also have a change notifier. So for complex types, you also have a change notifier. But my recommendation is when you're starting out, work with this method. If the method that I showed you in the first example is just, it does not suffice. It's too simple, that set state, init state method. My recommendation is kind of work with this method and see if it fits your requirements. See if it kind of helps you to get things done. Because in my view, this is the easiest and simplest method of dealing with state. Of course, there are other ways, other techniques of managing state, of dealing with state. But in all honesty, I don't really spend a lot of time analyzing the other state management techniques because I really, really like this method. And I really, really like the way it works and how clean it is and how it enables you to easily build reactive apps. So I really hope you enjoyed this video in our Flutter Fundamentals series. I'm going to have many more videos that's going to talk about the important Flutter concepts you need to master in order to build amazing and awesome apps. So if you enjoyed it, give this video a like, leave a comment, letting me know what you guys think. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, or just want to say thanks. That's always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any future Flutter videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you real soon.